What would you do if the man who shattered your heart was the only one who could save your child's life? Tonight, we follow Elena Marlowe, a woman forced to face her greatest fear to save what matters most. This isn't just another love story. This is about sacrifice, secrets, and the devastating price of pride when a child's life hangs in the balance. Picture this: you're 32 years old, you've built a life from nothing, and you've spent 8 years convincing yourself that you don't need the man who walked away from you. Then a doctor looks you in the eye and tells you that your 7-year-old son needs a bone marrow transplant, and there's only one person in the world who might be a genetic match. The billionaire CEO who left you pregnant and alone. Quick question before we dive in. Where are you watching from tonight? Drop your location in the comments below. If you're new to Gilded Hearts, hit that subscribe button now because you won't want to miss how this impossible story unfolds. And if you're already hooked, smash that like button and share this with someone who needs to hear it. Elena Marlowe never imagined she'd have to speak the name Damian Blackwood again. But when your child is dying, pride becomes a luxury you can no longer afford. Tonight, we're about to witness what happens when a mother's love collides with a billionaire's secrets. And trust me, neither Elena nor Damian is prepared for what's coming next. Meet Elena Marlowe. At 32, she possesses the kind of beauty that sneaks up on you, not the polished perfection you see in magazines, but something deeper, more authentic. Her chestnut hair catches the light in ways that remind you of autumn leaves, framing a face that tells a story. It's a face marked by grace earned through struggle, by smiles that have learned to hide tears, by eyes that have seen both love and loss in their depths. Every morning at 6 a.m. sharp, Elena walks through the sliding glass doors of St. Mary's Hospital, her worn sneakers squeaking against the polished linoleum floors. The building itself is nothing special, a mid-sized community hospital that serves the working-class neighborhoods on the east side of the city. The paint on the walls could use refreshing, the equipment isn't the latest model, and the coffee in the break room tastes like it was brewed sometime last week. But for Elena, these hallways represent something precious: stability. Her nursing scrubs are always perfectly pressed, even though she bought them secondhand from a medical supply store that was going out of business. She pins her hair back with the same silver barrette she's worn for 3 years, a small vanity in a life where vanities are carefully rationed. The pay from her job barely covers rent on their modest 2-bedroom apartment, but Elena has built something here that money can't buy: a life worth living. Because waiting at home, probably still tangled in superhero sheets and dreaming of fantastic adventures, is the reason she fights through every exhausting day. Noah Marlowe, her 7-year-old son, is Elena's entire universe condensed into 4 feet of boundless energy and endless questions. Noah has inherited his mother's green eyes, but where Elena's hold depths of caution earned through hard experience, his sparkle with a kind of wonder that can only belong to childhood. He has a cowlick that refuses to behave no matter how much Elena smooths it down in the mornings, and a gap-toothed grin that could power the entire hospital if they could figure out how to harness its brightness. In the evenings, after Elena returns from her 12-hour shifts, Noah shows her the drawings he's created while staying with Mrs. Chun, their elderly neighbor who watches him after school. His artwork covers their refrigerator like colorful stamps on an envelope: superheroes with impossible powers, dragons that breathe rainbows instead of fire, and always, pictures of the two of them. Elena and Noah, hand in hand, facing whatever the world might throw at them. He helps fold laundry with his small hands, chattering about his day at Lincoln Elementary while they sort socks and smooth wrinkles from discount store t-shirts. His questions flow like water. Why do clouds change shapes? Where do dreams come from when we're sleeping? Why don't superheroes ever seem to get tired of saving people? Elena answers as best she can, sometimes consulting the library books she checks out when her internet cuts off mid-month, sometimes inventing answers that are more beautiful than truthful. To anyone watching them navigate their quiet life, they appear to be exactly what they seem: another single mother and son making the best of their circumstances. Elena shops with coupons, Noah wears hand-me-downs from the church donation box, and they celebrate birthdays with homemade cake and dollar store decorations. Their happiness is real, hard-earned, and completely self-contained. But Elena carries a secret that would shatter this carefully constructed piece if it ever came to light. A secret that has a name she hasn't spoken aloud in 8 years, though it still haunts her dreams and makes her hands shake when memories surface unbidden. That secret has a name that still makes Elena's breath catch in her throat: Damian Blackwood. The name alone carries weight in this city. You see it on the sides of buildings, on charity donation announcements, in the business section of newspapers that Elena can't afford to buy, but sometimes glimpses in the hospital waiting rooms. Damian Blackwood, CEO and heir to Blackwood Enterprises, a business empire that spans 3 continents and touches industries from real estate to renewable energy. At 35, Damian has become everything Elena once dreamed of and everything she now fears encountering. He commands boardrooms like a general commanding armies, his presence filling spaces in ways that make grown men straighten their spines and powerful women reconsider their strategies. Those steel-gray eyes that once looked at Elena with infinite tenderness now negotiate billion-dollar deals with the precision of a surgeon wielding a scalpel. His sharp features have graced the covers of Fortune and Forbes, usually accompanied by headlines about his latest acquisition or his rumored political ambitions. The world sees power wrapped in Armani suits, success measured in stock prices and profit margins, confidence so absolute it seems untouchable. Damian Blackwood is the kind of man who gets what he wants because he's never learned to accept no as a final answer. But Elena remembers a different Damian. She remembers the man who used to trace lazy patterns on her skin in the moonlight streaming through her tiny apartment window, his touch reverent as if he were memorizing every inch of her. She remembers how he whispered promises of forever against her hair while she dozed in his arms, his voice soft with a kind of vulnerability he never showed the rest of the world. She remembers how he looked at her like she was his entire universe, like all the money and power and family expectations meant nothing compared to the way she laughed at his terrible jokes or how she listened to his dreams of building something meaningful beyond just accumulating wealth. 8 years ago, their love affair was conducted in secret, hidden from a world that would never have understood how the heir to a business empire could fall for a nursing student from the wrong side of town. Elena was nobody in the eyes of high society, just another girl working her way through school, waiting tables at night to pay for textbooks, dreaming of a future that seemed impossibly far away. But to Damian, she had been everything. Or so she'd believed. Their relationship existed in stolen moments and whispered conversations. Late-night dinners in hole-in-the-wall restaurants where no one would recognize him, long drives to beaches outside the city where they could walk hand in hand without cameras or expectations. He would pick her up after her shifts at the upscale restaurant where she waitressed, driving whatever car wouldn't attract attention, and they would disappear into a world that belonged only to them. What happened between them was supposed to stay hidden, protected from the complications that came with Damian's last name and the responsibilities that shadowed his every move. Elena had been content with their secret, understanding that his world came with rules she wasn't ready to navigate. She'd been willing to wait, to be patient, to let their love grow in the shadows until it was strong enough to withstand the spotlight. But secrets, Elena learned, have expiration dates. When Damian disappeared from her life without explanation, without goodbye, without even the courtesy of a conversation, Elena was left with more than just a shattered heart. She was left carrying his child, facing a future that had been rewritten overnight, trying to make sense of promises that had apparently meant nothing to the man who'd spoken them. For 7 years, Elena built walls around that secret higher and stronger than anything Damian's architects had ever designed. She convinced herself that Noah was better off without knowing his father, that they were complete as a family of 2, that the man who'd walked away from them had forfeited any right to the beautiful child he'd never known existed. She taught herself not to flinch when she heard Damian's name on the news or saw his photograph in magazines. She constructed a life where the past stayed buried, where her son could grow up without the complications that came with having a billionaire father who'd proven himself capable of abandoning the people he claimed to love. They were complete, Elena told herself. They were enough. They didn't need anyone else, especially not the man who taught her that some promises are just words spoken in the dark with no intention behind them. But fate, Elena was about to discover, has a cruel sense of timing and an even crueler sense of irony. It started on a Tuesday afternoon in October, the kind of crisp fall day when the leaves were just beginning to turn and Noah had been begging to stay after school to play on the playground equipment. Elena had agreed, grateful for the extra hour to finish her shift without rushing, planning to pick him up on her way home with maybe a stop for ice cream if her budget could stretch that far. Instead, she received a phone call that made her blood turn to ice water in her veins. Mrs. Marlowe? This is Principal Rodriguez at Lincoln Elementary. Noah collapsed during recess. We've called an ambulance, and they're taking him to St. Mary's Hospital. You should meet them there immediately. Elena's nurse training kicked in even as her mother's heart began to fracture. She knew the protocols, understood the procedures, could list a dozen benign reasons why a 7-year-old might faint during recess. Dehydration, low blood sugar, overexertion, growing pains, all things that could be easily treated, easily explained, easily fixed. She drove to the hospital with her hands steady on the wheel and her mind cataloging possibilities, refusing to let panic take root until she had facts. This was what she did every day. She helped other families navigate medical scares, held their hands through uncertainty, offered reassurance based on knowledge and experience. But when she arrived at St. Mary's emergency department and saw Noah on a gurney, looking impossibly small against the white sheets, all her professional composure crumbled. This wasn't someone else's child, someone else's crisis. This was her baby, pale and frightened, reaching for her with a trust that only children can offer their parents. "Mom." His voice was smaller than she'd ever heard it, uncertain in a way that made her chest tight. "I'm here, sweetheart. Mama's right here." She took his hand, noting how cold his fingers felt against hers, how his usual vibrant energy seemed dimmed. The initial tests seemed routine. Blood work, EKG, basic metabolic panels. All things Elena had ordered for countless patients, all procedures that usually revealed simple, treatable conditions. Maybe Noah was just tired from a growth spurt. Maybe he needed better nutrition, more iron in his diet, earlier bedtimes. Maybe this was just one of those childhood scares that would become a family story they'd laugh about years later. Dr. Martinez, the attending physician Elena had worked with dozens of times, ran the preliminary tests with the kind of methodical care that should have been reassuring. Elena knew him to be thorough, competent, someone who didn't panic easily or jump to worst-case scenarios. Which made his expression, when he returned with the initial results, all the more terrifying. "Elena," he said, his voice carrying the carefully controlled tone doctors use when they're about to deliver news that will change everything, "we need to run some additional tests." Those additional tests became more tests, which became consultations with specialists, which became Elena sitting in a sterile hospital room at 2 in the morning, holding her son's hand while he slept fitfully under harsh fluorescent lights. And then came the moment that split Elena's life into before and after, the moment when Dr. Martinez sat across from her in that same room and spoke the words that would haunt her for the rest of her days. "Mrs. Marlowe, Noah has a rare blood disorder called aplastic anemia. His bone marrow has essentially stopped producing the blood cells his body needs to function. Without treatment, specifically a bone marrow transplant from a genetically compatible donor, Noah has approximately 6 months to live." The room spun around Elena. Her medical training provided clinical understanding of what those words meant, but her heart couldn't process the reality. 6 months. Her bright, beautiful boy who drew pictures of superheroes and asked impossible questions about clouds and dreams had 6 months unless they could find someone whose genetic makeup matched as closely enough to save his life. "What do we need to do?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. "How do we find a donor?" Dr. Martinez's expression grew even more grave. "We'll start with a national bone marrow registry, of course. We'll test you, any relatives you can contact. But Elena, you need to understand, Noah's genetic markers are unusual. The combination of factors we're looking for is extremely rare. He needs someone who shares very specific DNA sequences, someone who's essentially a genetic mirror." Elena's world shattered in that moment, not just from the diagnosis, but from the terrible understanding that began to dawn on her. She knew, with the crushing certainty that comes from years of hiding the truth, exactly whose DNA would mirror her son's. She searched every registry anyway, contacted distant relatives she hadn't spoken to in years, begged doctors for alternatives, experimental treatments, anything that might save Noah without forcing her to face the impossible. For 2 weeks, she clung to hope that grew thinner with each negative result, each failed match, each gentle shake of a doctor's head. The answer was always the same. Noah needed a close genetic match, someone whose blood told the same story as his own, someone whose DNA carried the same rare markers that made him so difficult to match. There was only one person on Earth who could be that match, and Elena had spent 8 years trying to forget he existed. The man she swore she'd never see again. The man who'd abandoned them both without explanation or apology. The man who didn't even know he had a son. Damian Blackwood. Standing in that hospital corridor at 3 in the morning, clutching Noah's test results in her trembling hands, Elena faced a choice that would have seemed impossible just weeks before. She could let her pride, her anger, her justified hurt keep her from asking for help from the man who'd shattered her heart. She could protect the secret she'd guarded for 8 years, maintain the walls she'd built around their small, safe life. Or she could swallow everything, her pride, her pain, her carefully constructed independence, and walk back into the world of the man who'd taught her that love could disappear without warning. The choice between her heart and her son's life wasn't really a choice at all. But as she stood there in the fluorescent-lit hallway, listening to the beep of monitors and the whispered conversations of night shift nurses, Elena realized that approaching Damien meant more than just asking for medical help. It meant revealing the secret that would change everything for all of them. It meant telling the most powerful man in the city that he had a son who was dying, a child he'd never known existed, a piece of himself walking around in the world carrying his DNA and Elena's stubborn chin and a gap-toothed smile that could light up entire rooms. What would Damien do when he learned the truth? Would he help them, or would he see Noah as just another complication in his perfectly orchestrated life? Would he use the situation against Elena somehow, or would some part of the man she'd once loved still exist beneath all that power and success? There was only one way to find out, and it terrified Elena more than any diagnosis ever could. Tomorrow, she would have to do the one thing she'd sworn she'd never do. She would have to walk back into Damien Blackwood's world, look him in the eye, and ask the man who destroyed her heart to save their son's life. The question that would haunt her through the sleepless hours ahead was simple and impossible. What would you have done in Elena's place? Could you face someone who shattered you completely if it meant saving your child? Could you trust someone who'd proven themselves untrustworthy when the stakes were literally life and death? Elena was about to find out if a mother's love could overcome 8 years of hurt, and whether the man who'd once promised her forever had any of that promise left to give. For 3 sleepless nights, Elena sat in that uncomfortable hospital chair, watching her son grow paler with each passing hour. The superhero-themed hospital gown that had seemed almost cheerful when they first arrived now hung loose on Noah's shrinking frame, making him look impossibly small against the stark white sheets. His small fingers traced the cartoon figures printed on the fabric, Spider-Man, Batman, Wonder Woman, as if drawing strength from their fictional powers, while his mother wrestled with a decision that felt like choosing between her soul and her child's life. The monitors beeped their steady rhythm, marking time in a world where time had become their enemy. Each hour that passed was an hour stolen from Noah's future, each day of indecision a day closer to the unthinkable. Elena found herself memorizing the pattern of his breathing, counting the beats between his heartbeats, as if her vigilance alone could keep death at bay. During visiting hours, Noah would ask questions that broke Elena's heart with their innocent complexity. "Mom, why do I feel so tired all the time? Why can't I go home and play with Tommy from next door?" She would smooth his unruly hair and make up stories about brave knights who had to rest in magical castles to regain their strength, but the lies tasted like ash in her mouth. How do you explain to a 7-year-old that his father, the father he's never known exists, might be the key to his survival? How do you prepare yourself to face the person who left you broken and pregnant at 24, now knowing that your pride might be the thing that kills your child? Elena's best friend and fellow nurse, Maria Santos, had been coming by every evening after her own shift ended. Maria was the kind of friend who brought terrible hospital coffee and made it taste better just by sharing it, who could make Elena laugh even in the darkest moments, who knew all of Elena's secrets except the one that mattered most. On the 3rd night, as Noah dozed fitfully under the influence of mild sedatives, Maria finally said what Elena had been dreading to hear. "Elena, mi amor, you need to stop torturing yourself. This isn't about you and whoever Noah's father is anymore. This is about saving your son's life. Whatever happened between you two, whatever he did to hurt you, it doesn't matter now. Swallow your pride and make the call." Elena's hands trembled as she gripped her lukewarm coffee cup. "You don't understand, Maria. It's not that simple." "Then make it simple," Maria replied, her voice gentle but firm. "Write down his number. Pick up the phone. Tell him about Noah. Let him decide whether he wants to help or not. But don't let your fear make the decision for him." But Elena's wounds ran deeper than pride, deeper than the simple fear of rejection or humiliation. They ran to the core of who she'd become over the past 8 years. The woman who'd learned to change her own flat tires and fix her own leaky faucets. Who'd worked double shifts to pay for Noah's school supplies and birthday parties. Who'd attended every parent-teacher conference, every soccer game, every school play alone, watching other children run to two parents while Noah had learned to look for just one face in the crowd. She'd built her identity around not needing anyone, around being complete as a family of two. Asking for help from Damian Blackwood wouldn't just be swallowing her pride. It would be admitting that everything she'd told herself about their self-sufficiency was a carefully constructed lie. Meanwhile, 43 floors above the city streets, Damian Blackwood sat in his glass-walled corner office, completely unaware that his past was about to collide with his present in ways that would shatter the carefully controlled world he built around himself. His assistant, Jennifer Hartley, briefed him on the morning's agenda with the kind of crisp efficiency that had made her invaluable over the past 5 years. Merger discussions with a renewable energy company in California. A conference call with investors in London. A charity gala where his presence was expected, his checkbook even more so. The kind of day that had become routine in Damian's world, moving millions of dollars with a signature, making decisions that affected thousands of employees, building an empire that bore his family's name with the weight of expectation that had followed him since birth. But as Jennifer spoke, Damian found himself staring out those floor-to-ceiling windows at the city below, his mind wandering to places he trained himself not to go. Somewhere down there, in the maze of streets and buildings and ordinary lives, people were falling in love, having children, building families without the complications that came with his last name. Somewhere down there, life was happening in ways he'd once dreamed of, but had learned to see as incompatible with the responsibilities that came with being a Blackwood. He'd been having these moments more frequently lately, these lapses in focus that his board members would find alarming if they knew about them. Moments when he wondered what might have happened if he'd made different choices 8 years ago. If he'd been braver, stronger, less willing to let his mother's manipulations dictate the course of his life. But regret was a luxury Damian couldn't afford, just like love had been a luxury he'd convinced himself he couldn't afford. So he pushed the thoughts aside, focused on Jennifer's words about quarterly projections and expansion plans, and told himself that he'd made the right choices for everyone involved. He had no idea that his own flesh and blood was fighting for life in a hospital bed across town, or that the woman who'd once been his entire world was about to walk back into his life with a truth that would change everything. Thursday morning dawned gray and rain-soaked, as if the sky itself was mourning what Elena was about to do. She stood on the sidewalk outside Blackwood Enterprises, her heart hammering against her ribs with a rhythm that threatened to drown out her ability to think clearly. The building stretched into the sky like a monument to everything she'd never been part of, all glass and steel and intimidating architecture that seemed designed to make ordinary people feel small. Security guards in expensive suits monitored the marble lobby through glass doors that probably cost more than Elena's annual salary. People in $1,000 outfits moved through the space with a confidence that came from belonging in a world where money solved problems and opened doors. This was Damian's world now, polished, powerful, completely removed from the realm of hospital waiting rooms and medical bills and children who drew pictures of superheroes on the backs of unpaid electric bills. The woman who walked through those glass doors was not the same girl who had once fallen for Damian Blackwood's charm 8 years ago. That girl had been hopeful, naive, willing to believe that love could conquer the practical realities of class differences and family expectations. This Elena had been forged by years of struggle, shaped by single motherhood, strengthened by the kind of sacrifice that transforms soft dreams into unbreakable resolve. She wore her best dress, a simple navy blue sheath she'd bought 3 years ago for parent-teacher conferences and job interviews, the kind of dress that was respectable without being remarkable. Her shoes were comfortable rather than fashionable, her purse was practical rather than designer, and she carried Noah's medical files in a manila folder that looked shabby against the backdrop of marble and gold fixtures. But Elena had learned something about strength over the past 8 years. It didn't come from what you wore or what you owned or how much money sat in your bank account. It came from knowing what mattered most and being willing to fight for it regardless of the cost to your pride or your carefully constructed sense of independence. Getting to Damian required navigating layers of protection that would have intimidated the young woman Elena used to be. The reception desk was a fortress of polished mahogany staffed by women who looked like they'd stepped out of fashion magazines. The elevators required key cards that Elena didn't possess. Every surface gleamed with the kind of perfection that money could buy, from the fresh orchids in crystal vases to the abstract art that probably cost more than Elena's car. Damien's personal assistant, Jennifer Hartley, occupied an office that served as the final barrier between the outside world and the man Elena needed to see. Jennifer was everything Elena wasn't: perfectly coiffed, expensively dressed, radiating the kind of confidence that came from working at the right hand of power. She looked Elena up and down with the practiced dismissal of someone accustomed to turning away people who didn't belong in this rarefied atmosphere. "I'm sorry, but Mr. Blackwood doesn't take unscheduled appointments," Jennifer said, her voice carrying the polite condescension of someone who delivered this rejection countless times before. "If you'd like to submit a formal request through our website, someone from our office will review it and get back to you within 10 business days. Though I should mention that Mr. Blackwood's calendar is completely booked for the next 6 months." Elena had prepared for this moment, rehearsed the words that might get her past the gatekeepers and into the same room as the man who held her son's life in his hands. But standing there under Jennifer's dismissive gaze, surrounded by luxury she'd never be part of, Elena felt the careful script she'd planned crumble into dust. Instead, she heard herself say 5 words that came from the deepest part of her desperation. "Tell him Elena Marlowe is here." The effect was instantaneous and electric. Jennifer's carefully composed expression flickered, just for a moment, revealing something that looked almost like recognition before she regained control. But Elena had caught it, that brief moment when the professional mask had slipped, when something human and uncertain had shown through. "Tell him," Elena continued, her voice steadier than she felt, "it's about something he left behind 8 years ago." Jennifer's face went through a series of micro-expressions: surprise, calculation, something that might have been understanding. She'd worked for Damien Blackwood for 5 years, long enough to know that he was a man who revealed nothing about his personal life, who kept his emotions locked away behind layers of professional composure. But she'd also seen moments, brief glimpses when he thought no one was watching, where something haunted would flicker across his features. She'd seen him stare out those office windows with a look that all his money couldn't buy away, a longing so deep it seemed to come from his bones. Elena Marlowe was clearly a ghost from his past, and ghosts, Jennifer was learning, could still make billionaires tremble. 20 minutes later, Elena found herself standing in Damien's office, a space designed to overwhelm and intimidate anyone who entered it. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a commanding view of the city spread out below like a kingdom at the feet of its ruler. Awards and accolades lined the walls: Businessman of the Year, humanitarian awards, photographs of Damien shaking hands with presidents and prime ministers. Behind a mahogany desk that cost more than Elena made in a year sat the man who still haunted her dreams, even after all this time. 8 years had sharpened Damien's features, carved away any remaining softness from his face and replaced it with a kind of hard-edged handsomeness that graced magazine covers. Silver touched his temples now, adding distinction to the dark hair Elena remembered running her fingers through during stolen moments of intimacy. His steel-gray eyes held depths of experience and calculation that hadn't been there when he was 27 and still believed that love might be worth fighting for. He wore a perfectly tailored charcoal suit that emphasized the breadth of his shoulders and the lean strength of his frame, but Elena could see the tension in the line of his jaw, the way his hands gripped his expensive pen like it was a weapon he might need to deploy at any moment. This was Damien Blackwood, the CEO, the public figure, the man who'd learned to armor himself in power and success. But underneath all that polish, Elena caught glimpses of the man she'd once known, the one who'd held her like she was precious and promised her a future neither of them had been brave enough to fight for. The silence stretched between them, heavy with 8 years of unspoken words and unanswered questions. Elena had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times in her mind, planned exactly what she would say and how she would say it. But standing there in the overwhelming presence of everything Damien had become, she found herself reduced to the simplest possible greeting. "Hello, Damien," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Those 2 words carried the weight of 8 years' worth of pain, anger, regret, and desperate hope. They carried the memory of who they'd been together and the reality of who they'd become apart. Damien's response echoed in the sudden silence of the office, each word carefully measured and devastatingly precise. "I wondered when you'd finally come to collect." Elena's mind reeled. Come to collect? What did that even mean? She'd expected anger, coldness, perhaps dismissal. She'd prepared herself for him to call security, to refuse to see her, to treat her like a stranger who'd somehow gotten past his defenses. But this response suggested something else entirely, that he'd been expecting her, that this moment had been inevitable in ways she couldn't begin to understand. But before she could ask what he meant, before she could even begin to explain about Noah's condition and the desperate circumstances that had brought her here, Damien said something that made her blood turn to ice in her veins. "I've been waiting for you to use our son against me." The words hit Elena like a physical blow, stealing the breath from her lungs and making the luxurious office spin around her. Our son. He knew. Somehow, impossibly, Damien Blackwood knew that Noah existed, knew that he had a child he'd never met, knew the secret that Elena had guarded with her life for 8 years. But how was that even possible? How could he have known about Noah all these years? If he'd known, why had he never tried to contact them, never tried to be part of his son's life? What had really happened 8 years ago, and how many lies had Elena been living with all this time? The carefully constructed story she told herself about their breakup, about Damien's abandonment, about the choices she'd made to protect Noah from a father who didn't want them, all of it crumbled in an instant, leaving Elena standing in the wreckage of everything she thought she knew about her own life. Standing there in that glass tower, staring at the man who just revealed that her deepest secret had never been a secret at all, Elena realized that this confrontation was going to be far more complicated than she'd ever imagined. The question that now burned through her shock was devastating in its simplicity. If Damien had always known about Noah, what else had he known? And why had he chosen to stay away from the son who was now dying without his help? The room spun around Elena as Damien's words echoed in the sudden silence. Her carefully planned speech, her desperate plea, her fears about how he might react to learning he had a son, none of it mattered now. He knew. He had always known. The question that burned through her shock was devastatingly simple. How? Elena gripped the back of the leather chair in front of her, her knuckles white against the dark material as she fought to steady herself. 8 years of secrets, 8 years of protecting Noah from a father she believed had abandoned them, 8 years of building a life around the assumption that they were alone in the world. All of it was crashing down around her in this moment. You think I wouldn't have my security team investigate when my ex-girlfriend suddenly starts working at a hospital across town? Damien's voice was controlled, measured, but Elena could hear the storm brewing beneath that calm surface. You think I wouldn't notice when birth records showed a baby born 8 months after you disappeared from my life? He moved around his desk with the predatory grace of a man accustomed to controlling every situation, but Elena could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands clenched and unclenched at his sides. This wasn't the cool, collected CEO the world saw in boardrooms and magazine covers. This was a man who'd been carrying his own secrets, his own pain, for far too long. Elena's knees nearly buckled as the implications hit her. If you knew, why didn't you? What? Contact you? Damien's composure cracked like ice under pressure, revealing the raw emotion beneath. You made it clear you wanted nothing to do with me. You changed your phone number, moved to a different apartment, blocked every attempt I made to reach you. When my investigators confirmed you'd had my child, I figured you had your reasons for keeping him from me. The room filled with 8 years of unspoken pain, of misunderstandings that had grown into chasms neither of them had known how to cross. Elena's voice shook as the truth she'd buried for so long came pouring out like water through a broken dam. I left because your mother offered me $1 million to disappear, she said, the words tasting bitter on her tongue. Because she said you were engaged to Victoria Ashford and my pregnancy would ruin your political aspirations. Because I was 24 and terrified and pregnant, and I believed her when she said you'd never choose me over your empire. The silence that followed was deafening. Damien's face went through a series of emotions, surprise, rage, devastating understanding, before settling into something that looked like grief. When he spoke, his voice was barely controlled, each word carefully measured as if he were afraid of what might happen if he let his emotions run free. My mother told me you took the money and left. That you said the baby wasn't mine. That you wanted nothing to do with our family's complications. His hands were shaking now, the mask of corporate control completely stripped away. She said you'd found someone else, someone who could give you a simpler life than anything I could offer. Elena felt the breath leave her lungs in a rush. I never took her money. I tore up that check and flushed it down my toilet. I never said Noah wasn't yours. I never said I wanted nothing to do with you. Her voice broke on the last words, 8 years of suppressed anguish finally finding its voice. Damien sank into his chair as if his legs could no longer support him. She played us against each other. My own mother destroyed the only thing that ever mattered to me, and I was too proud, too hurt, too willing to believe the worst to fight for the truth. The magnitude of Margaret Blackwood's manipulation was staggering. She'd orchestrated their separation with surgical precision, feeding each of them lies designed to keep them apart, to protect the Blackwood legacy from what she saw as an unsuitable connection. She'd stolen 8 years from them, 8 years that Noah could have had his father, 8 years that Elena could have had support in raising their son. All this time, Elena whispered, all this time you knew about Noah and you stayed away because you thought I didn't want you in his life. All this time you raised our son alone because you thought I'd chosen money and power over love. Damien's voice cracked on the last word. God, Elena, what have we done? What have we lost? But even as the truth of their mutual betrayal settled between them like a living thing, Elena remembered why she was there. The revelation of Margaret's lies, the understanding of how they'd been manipulated, the grief for all the time they'd lost. None of it mattered if they couldn't save Noah now. Damien, she said, her voice steadying with purpose, we can process this later. Right now, Noah is dying. The doctors say he needs a bone marrow transplant from a genetic match, and you're the only person who might be compatible. I know you have every reason to hate me, to think I kept your son from you out of spite, but please. Elena, stop. Damien was on his feet again, moving toward her with an intensity that made her breath catch. You don't need to beg me to save my own child. Where is he? What hospital? What do the doctors need from me? Within 4 hours, Damien's world had been completely reorganized around a crisis he'd never seen coming. His private medical team, led by Dr. Sarah Chun, one of the most respected hematologists in the country, had taken over Noah's care with a kind of resources that Elena's insurance could never have provided. Advanced testing, experimental treatments, consultations with specialists from around the globe, everything that money could buy was suddenly at Noah's disposal. Dr. Chen's initial assessment confirmed what Elena's hospital had found, but brought hope they'd never dared to imagine. Standing in the pristine conference room of the private medical facility where Noah had been transferred, she delivered news that made Elena's heart soar with possibility. Mr. Blackwood, you're not just a match for your son. You're a perfect match. The genetic compatibility is extraordinary. I've rarely seen markers aligned so precisely. We can schedule the bone marrow transplant procedure immediately. But Dr. Chun was careful to explain that the road ahead wouldn't be simple. Bone marrow transplants were serious procedures, risky for both donor and patient, requiring weeks of recovery and careful monitoring. There would be pain, uncertainty, the possibility of complications that could arise despite the best medical care money could provide. The procedure itself will take several hours, Dr. Chin explained, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd performed hundreds of these operations. Mr. Blackwood, you'll be under general anesthesia while we extract bone marrow from your hip bone. It's painful but not dangerous. Noah's procedure is more complex. We'll need to prepare his system to accept the transplant, which means a course of chemotherapy to destroy his existing bone marrow first. Elena felt her stomach clench at the word chemotherapy. Her 7-year-old son, who was already so pale and weak, would have to endure even more before he could begin to get better. Damien seemed to read her thoughts. Whatever he needs, he said firmly. Whatever the risks, whatever the cost, whatever the timeline. We do everything possible. That night, in the family waiting room of the private medical facility, Elena and Damien sat beside their son's bed in a silence that was both comfortable and charged with unresolved emotion. Noah, pale but curious, looked between them with a kind of innocent perception that children possess, sensing that something important was happening even if he couldn't quite understand what. Elena had introduced Damien as someone very important who wants to help you get better, not ready to explain the complexity of their relationship to a child who is already dealing with more than any 7-year-old should have to handle. But Noah, being Noah, had his own way of getting to the heart of things. Are you a superhero? He asked Damien, studying his face with the kind of directness that only children can manage. You look like you could be a superhero. You're tall like Superman, and you have that serious face like Batman. Damien's composure, which had held through board meetings and business crises, through the revelation of his mother's manipulation and the shock of discovering he'd wasted 8 years believing lies, finally cracked completely. Tears he'd held back since Elena first walked into his office fell freely as he looked at this beautiful child who carried his DNA and Elena's gentle spirit and a gap-toothed smile that could light up entire rooms. "I'm trying to be, son," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm trying to be." Noah seemed satisfied with this answer, as if it confirmed something he'd suspected all along. "Good," he said matter-of-factly. "Mom could use a superhero. She works really hard, and sometimes she cries when she thinks I'm asleep, but she tries to hide it. I think she's been waiting for her superhero to come help her." Elena felt her own tears threatening as she watched this first interaction between father and son. There was something magical about seeing Damien's sharp features soften as he looked at Noah, seeing the way 8 years of walls and protection melted away in the face of paternal love. This was what she dreamed of once upon a time, Damien holding their child, being present for the small moments and the big ones, being the father she'd always known he could be if given the chance. The transplant procedure took place on a Tuesday morning in late November, almost exactly 1 month after Elena had first walked into Damien's office with her desperate plea. The surgery itself was a marvel of modern medicine, Damien's bone marrow, carefully extracted and processed, being infused into Noah's system through and for that seemed impossibly small for such a momentous procedure. Elena and Damien waited together in the surgical waiting room, their hands finding each other during the most terrifying moments, old habits of comfort reasserting themselves despite all the time and pain that had passed between them. They didn't talk much during those long hours. There would be time for conversations about forgiveness and trust and what their future might look like. For now, it was enough to wait together, to share the burden of hope and fear that came with watching their child fight for his life. When Dr. Chun emerged from the surgical suite 12 hours later, her smile told them everything they needed to know before she spoke a word. The transplant was successful. Noah's body is accepting the new bone marrow beautifully. We'll need to monitor him closely for the next few weeks, watch for signs of rejection or infection, but all the early indicators are positive. Your son is going to live. 3 months later, in the same hospital where this story had begun with Elena's desperate vigil, Noah Marlowe Blackwood celebrated his 8th birthday surrounded by more love than he'd ever known existed. His cheeks had color again, pink and healthy instead of the pale gray that had terrified Elena for so many weeks. His drawings had multiplied across every available surface, the hospital walls, the windows of his room, notebooks filled with superheroes and dragons and fantastical creatures that existed only in his imagination. And for the first time in his life, Noah had 2 parents watching him blow out candles on a birthday cake that hadn't come from the discount grocery store. Damien had insisted on hiring the best pediatric party planner in the city, transforming Noah's hospital room into a superhero headquarters complete with decorations, costumes, and enough presents to stock a small toy store. But the real gift was simpler and more precious than anything money could buy. The sight of his parents working together, laughing together, slowly rebuilding something that had been broken by lies and time and the cruel manipulations of people who thought they knew better than the human heart. The transplant had been successful, but the real healing took much longer. Elena and Damien had to learn how to trust each other again, how to navigate the complicated waters of co-parenting and shared custody, and the possibility of something more than friendship growing from the ashes of their broken relationship. They attended family therapy sessions with Dr. Rebecca Morrison, a counselor who specialized in helping families rebuild after trauma and separation. In the safety of Dr. Morrison's office, they slowly unpacked 8 years of hurt and misunderstanding, learning to separate the lies they'd been told from the truths they'd lived. Elena had to learn to accept help, to let Damien share the burden of parenting decisions and medical expenses and the 1,000 small responsibilities that came with raising a child. Damien had to learn to be present for the mundane moments, not just the dramatic crises, school plays and soccer games and bedtime stories that didn't make headlines but mattered infinitely more than any business deal. They were careful not to rush into anything romantic, both of them scarred by how thoroughly they'd misunderstood each other 8 years before. But slowly, very slowly, they began to remember why they'd fallen in love in the first place. The way Damien's eyes lit up when Noah showed him a new drawing. The way Elena's laugh could make even the most stressful day feel manageable. The way they fit together as a family, as if the 8 years of separation had been nothing more than a bad dream they were finally waking up from. Damien's mother, Margaret Blackwood, faced consequences for her deception that reverberated through the family's social circles and business relationships. The engagement to Victoria Ashford that had been used as leverage against Elena had actually been broken years earlier, another lie Margaret had constructed to keep her son from pursuing a relationship she deemed unsuitable. When the full extent of Margaret's manipulation came to light, Damien confronted her with a cold fury that shook the foundations of Blackwood Enterprises. She was removed from her position on the company's board of directors, her access to family trust funds was restricted, and her influence over Damien's personal and professional decisions ended permanently. "You stole 8 years from me," Damien told her during their final conversation, his voice carrying the weight of absolute finality. "8 years I could have spent with my son, with the woman I loved. You nearly killed my child with your lies. You destroyed the only thing that ever mattered to me because it didn't fit your narrow definition of what a Blackwood's life should look like." Margaret's attempts at justification, claims that she'd acted in his best interests, that Elena wouldn't have been suitable for someone with his responsibilities, that family legacy required sacrifices, fell on deaf ears. Some wounds, Damien realized, take generations to heal. Some betrayals cut so deep that forgiveness becomes impossible. But for Noah's sake, for the future they were building as a family, Elena and Damien chose to focus forward rather than backward. They couldn't change the past, couldn't reclaim the years they'd lost, couldn't undo the pain Margaret's manipulations had caused. But they could choose how to write the next chapter of their story. 6 months after the transplant, on a warm spring morning when Noah was strong enough to play soccer in the park and Elena had learned to sleep through the night without checking his breathing, Damien asked her a question that changed everything. "Do you think we could try again?" he said, his voice carrying the same vulnerability she remembered from their early days together. Not because of Noah, not because of guilt or obligation or anything else, but because I never stopped loving you, and I think maybe, if we're careful and honest and brave enough, we might be able to build something even better than what we had before. Elena looked at this man who'd saved their son's life, who'd learned to braid Noah's hair and read bedtime stories and attend parent-teacher conferences with the same intensity he brought to billion-dollar mergers. She thought about the family therapy sessions where he'd listened to her pain without defensiveness, where he'd accepted responsibility for his own role in their 8-year separation. She thought about the way Noah's face lit up when his father walked into a room, the way her own heart had slowly opened again to possibilities she'd thought were lost forever. "Yes," she said, and meant it with every fiber of her being. "Yes, I think we could." Their second chance wouldn't be easy. It never is when love has to grow back from broken ground. But they had something now that they'd lacked 8 years ago, the knowledge that life is fragile and precious, that family is worth fighting for, and that sometimes the people who hurt us most are also the ones capable of saving us. Standing in that park, watching Noah chase butterflies with the boundless energy of a healthy 8-year-old, Elena and Damien began to write a new story, one where love wins not because it's easy, but because it's worth every struggle, every sacrifice, every moment of courage it takes to choose each other again and again. Some fairy tales end with happily ever after. Others end with the harder, more beautiful truth. Happily ever after is something you build one day at a time, one choice at a time, one act of love at a time, for the rest of your life. 6 months after Elena had walked into that glass tower with medical files clutched in her trembling hands and a heart heavy with 8 years of buried pain, she found herself standing in a place she'd never imagined she'd be again. Damien's penthouse kitchen, with its gleaming marble countertops and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a breathtaking view of the city below, had been transformed from a sterile showcase into something that felt remarkably like home. The morning sunlight streamed through those expansive windows, casting golden patterns across the hardwood floors as Elena watched a scene that made her heart swell with a happiness she'd almost forgotten was possible. Damien, still in his pajama pants and a t-shirt that had somehow acquired flower handprints, was attempting to teach Noah the fine art of pancake making. Their son, now 8 and radiating the kind of vibrant health that made Elena thank God every single day, stood on a step stool beside his father, his tongue poking out in concentration as he tried to flip a pancake without sending it flying across the kitchen. "Like this, Dad?" Noah asked, his voice bright with excitement as he maneuvered the spatula with the intense focus of a surgeon performing delicate operations. "Perfect, buddy," Damien replied, his voice warm with paternal pride as he guided Noah's small hands. "You're getting really good at this. Pretty soon you'll be making breakfast for me and Mom." Their laughter filled the space that had once echoed with loneliness, transforming what had been Damien's sterile bachelor sanctuary into something alive and warm and beautifully chaotic. Pancake batter dotted the pristine countertops, flour-dusted surfaces that had never seen anything messier than expensive wine spills, and the air hummed with a kind of domestic happiness that no amount of money could purchase, but that Elena had learned was more valuable than any fortune. This wasn't the fairy tale ending that Elena had dreamed of at 24, when she'd been young and naive enough to believe that love conquered all obstacles without requiring sacrifice or struggle. This was something far better because it was real. Built on truth instead of fantasy, strengthened by the kind of struggle that either destroys relationships or forges them into something unbreakable. This was love that had survived betrayal, pride, devastating misunderstandings, and the ultimate test of a child's life hanging in the balance. Elena had learned that true love stories don't end with a wedding and a promise of happily ever after. They begin there, in the daily choice to show up for each other, to work through the complicated reality of blending lives that had been separate for so long, to build trust brick by careful brick after it had been shattered by lies and time and the cruel manipulations of people who thought they knew better than the human heart. The past 6 months had been a masterclass in patience, forgiveness, and the delicate art of learning to love someone all over again. There had been family therapy sessions where they'd excavated years of hurt and misunderstanding, learning to separate the lies they'd been told from the truths they'd lived. There had been awkward moments as they figured out how to co-parent Noah, how to navigate the logistics of custody and school events and bedtime routines when Elena was still living in her modest apartment across town and Damien was adjusting to having his penthouse invaded by superhero action figures and crayon drawings. But there had also been moments of pure magic. The first time Noah had called Damien Dad without prompting, the word falling from his lips as naturally as if he'd been saying it his entire life. The evening when Elena had fallen asleep on Damien's couch after a long shift at the hospital, and she'd awakened to find Noah curled up beside her and Damien covering them both with a blanket, his eyes soft with a kind of contentment she remembered from their early days together. The night when Damien had asked her to move in with them, not because of convenience or Noah's needs, but because he couldn't imagine facing another day without her presence making his sterile penthouse feel like home. Elena had said yes, but not immediately. She'd needed time to think, to make sure she was making the decision for the right reasons, to ensure that she wasn't just being swept away by gratitude or the romantic notion of their family finally being complete. When she'd finally said yes, it had been with the hard-won wisdom of someone who understood that love wasn't just about feeling, but about choosing. Choosing to trust again after betrayal, choosing to be vulnerable after being hurt, choosing to build something new from the ashes of something that had been destroyed by forces beyond their control. The moving process had been an adventure in itself. Elena's modest possessions looked almost comical in the vast spaces of Damien's penthouse, but he'd insisted on finding places for everything that mattered to her. Her grandmother's rocking chair now sat by the living room windows where she could watch Noah play in the building's private garden. Her collection of nursing textbooks found shelf space in what had been Damien's home office, sharing the room with his business journals and Noah's growing library of children's books. Noah had adapted to their new living situation with the resilience that children possess in abundance, treating the penthouse like an adventure playground while somehow making Damien understand that all the luxury in the world meant nothing if it didn't include family movie nights and pillow forts and the beautiful chaos of a child's imagination running wild in spaces that had been designed for adult sophistication. Watching them now, Elena marveled at how naturally Damien had slipped into fatherhood. The man who commanded boardrooms and negotiated billion-dollar deals with ruthless efficiency had learned to braid Noah's hair for school pictures, to read bedtime stories with different voices for each character, to attend parent-teacher conferences with the same intensity he brought to merger negotiations. He discovered that being a father required a completely different kind of strength than being a CEO, and he'd risen to the challenge with a dedication that made Elena fall in love with him all over again. "Mom, look," Noah called out, successfully flipping a pancake that landed perfectly in the center of the pan. "I did it. Did you see?" "I saw, sweetheart," Elena replied, her voice thick with emotion as she watched this simple moment that represented so much more than breakfast preparation. "You're amazing." Damien caught her eye across the kitchen, and the look that passed between them carried the weight of everything they'd been through, everything they'd lost, and everything they'd found again. It was a look that spoke of second chances and hard-won wisdom, of love that had been tested by fire and emerged stronger than ever. This wasn't just about the pancakes, or the laughter, or even the undeniable joy of watching their son thrive in ways Elena had once thought impossible. This was about the realization that sometimes the people who hurt us most are also the ones capable of saving us. That sometimes the love we think is lost forever is just waiting for the right moment, the right crisis, the right combination of courage and desperation to bring it back to life. Elena thought about that morning 8 months ago when she'd sat in Noah's hospital room, facing the impossible choice between her pride and her son's life. She'd had no idea that walking into Damien's office would lead to this moment, to this kitchen filled with laughter and flour and the kind of domestic happiness she'd stopped believing was possible for someone like her. Sometimes, she reflected, a child's innocent question could change everything. When Noah had asked Damien if he was a superhero during those first terrifying days in the hospital, he'd unknowingly offered his father the chance to become exactly that. Not the kind of superhero who wore capes and fought villains, but the kind who showed up when it mattered most, who put aside his own hurt and pride to save a child he'd never known, who learned that real heroism isn't about being perfect but about being present when the people you love need you most. The pancakes were ready now, stacked high on a plate that Noah carried to the dining table with a kind of ceremony reserved for state occasions. Damien followed with orange juice and coffee, while Elena brought the syrup and the kind of pure maple variety that Noah had never tasted before moving into the penthouse. As they sat down to eat this simple breakfast that felt like a celebration, Elena found herself thinking about the choices that had brought them to this moment. Had she and Damien made the right decisions along the way? Would their love have been strong enough to survive without Noah's crisis forcing them to confront the lies that had kept them apart for 8 years? Could they have found their way back to each other without the urgency of their son's life hanging in the balance? She thought about Margaret Blackwood, Damien's mother, who had orchestrated their separation with such calculated cruelty. Elena had struggled with forgiveness there, had spent many therapy sessions working through her anger at a woman who'd nearly destroyed their family to protect what she saw as the Blackwood legacy. In the end, Elena had chosen to forgive not because Margaret deserved it, but because carrying that anger would have poisoned the happiness they were trying to build. Margaret herself remained unrepentant, convinced even now that she'd acted in her son's best interests. The relationship between mother and son had been irreparably damaged, but Damien had made peace with that loss. Some prices, he'd learned, were too high to pay, even for family loyalty. The engagement to Victoria Ashford that Margaret had used as leverage against Elena turned out to have been another fabrication, broken off years earlier when Damien realized he could never love anyone the way he'd loved the nursing student who disappeared from his life without explanation. Victoria had found happiness elsewhere, married a senator from Connecticut, and occasionally appeared in society pages that Damien no longer bothered to read. As Elena watched Noah chat excitedly about his plans for the day, a soccer game in the park, followed by a trip to the museum to see the new dinosaur exhibit, she realized that their story wasn't really about second chances or forgiveness or even the power of love to overcome impossible obstacles. Their story was about showing up. About the courage it takes to walk into a room where you're not wanted and ask for help from someone who has every reason to refuse you. About the strength it takes to put aside your own pain to save someone else's child, even when that child represents everything you thought you'd lost. About the wisdom it takes to recognize that sometimes the ending we need isn't the one we planned, and that the love we build after loss is often stronger than the love we started with. Elena had entered Damien's office 8 months ago with medical files and a broken heart, prepared to beg for her son's life from a man she believed had abandoned them both. She was leaving this kitchen this morning with something far more precious than the happy ending she'd once dreamed of. She was leaving with the knowledge that love isn't something that happens to you, but something you choose to create, day by day, choice by choice, moment by moment. Do you think Elena and Damien made the right choices along the way? Could their love have survived without Noah's crisis to bring them back together? And what would you have done if you'd been in Margaret's position all those years ago, watching your son fall in love with someone you believed was wrong for him? These are the questions that linger long after the story ends, the questions that remind us that every choice we make has the power to heal or to harm, to bring families together or tear them apart. As Noah finished his last bite of pancakes and announced his readiness to conquer the world, Elena and Damien shared one more look across the table. This was their family now, imperfect, complicated, built from the ruins of what they'd thought they wanted and shaped into something better than they'd ever imagined possible. Thank you for joining us on this emotional journey through love and loss, pride and sacrifice, the power of family and the courage it takes to choose hope over hurt. If this story touched your heart, if it reminded you of the power of second chances or the importance of fighting for the people who matter most, then it has served its purpose. These aren't just stories. They're reminders that love, real love, is always worth fighting for, even when the odds seem impossible and the cost feels too high to bear. Until next time, remember this. Sometimes the ending we need isn't the one we planned, but it's always the one that teaches us who we really are when everything we thought we knew falls away. Sometimes the greatest love stories begin not with a kiss, but with the courage to ask for help when we need it most.